Welcome to the Gynarchy Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Kirti Patel. Here we place women's health and feminism front and center where they belong, engaging in conversations that range from the fundamental to the fearless. With insights from expert guests, we aim to break through the barriers of the patriarchy and envision a new world led by the Gynarchy. So let's get started and dive right in. Welcome to the Gynarchy Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Kirti Patel. And today we're going to be talking about how women have become society's safety net. Today, my guest is Jessica Calarco. Jessica is a professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's an award-winning teacher, a leading expert on families, schools, and inequalities. And her new book is titled Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net. I have a copy here. So I really enjoyed your book, Jessica.
Oh gosh, thank you so much for inviting me to be on the show today. It's a pleasure to get to speak with you about this, and certainly, in a timely moment, thinking about the role that women are playing in society and the kind of challenges that we're up against in the process too.
Absolutely, getting more difficult. So I usually like to start by hearing a little bit about your background.
Sure. So
as you mentioned, guest's background. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh gosh, absolutely. Yes. So as you mentioned, I'm a sociologist, and I mostly study families and schools and the kinds of decisions that people make and the role that those decisions play in larger patterns of inequalities, as well as the kinds of forces that people are up against, the role that policies and the role that structures and institutions play in constraining people's choices and often making life more difficult than it has to be. And that's the kind of work that I do, which often is very qualitative in nature. So going out and interviewing people or spending time in communities to really understand what people's lives are like day to day, and trying to understand sort of the lived impact of these broader realities in people's lives.
So how many years have you been doing this? What was your work prior to writing this book? I'm actually interested in that. What led you to this actually?
Yeah, so my early research was mostly on inequalities in education. I spent most of my dissertation research, for example, for my PhD, was looking at social class inequalities in classrooms and how kids from different backgrounds navigate interactions with teachers, who feels comfortable asking for help, for example, and why, and how that's rooted in differences in families' trust in institutions. And yet at the same time, I had my own two kids in 2014 and 2017, and I knew at that point, in part because of my own challenges related to childcare and family responsibilities, that I wasn't in a position to go and do another ethnographic project like what I'd done for my first book, which involved years of observing in schools and in communities and kind of following this group of families and kids over time. And I wasn't in a place where I could do that work, myself again, given family challenges. And so I wanted to develop a new project that I thought of at the time as sort of a study of the best laid plans of parenting, kind of rooted in some of my own experiences with having young kids. I was interested in how do parents develop ideas about the kind of parent that they want to be, and then what happens when life intervenes, often in very unequal ways, to shape whether parents can follow through on those decisions, and what happens if they don't, what kinds of pressures they're getting from people around them, for example. And I wanted it to be a project that I could get my students involved in. I had a large number of graduate students and undergraduate students who contributed to the project. We started by recruiting 250 pregnant women from prenatal clinics in Indiana. And so I had students who were helping with the on-the-ground recruiting, and also students who were helping with conducting interviews and conducting surveys with these women, who I planned to follow over time from pregnancy through their first couple of years postpartum. But I had sort of my own best laid plans moment with the project, in the sense that the pandemic hit in the middle of the data collection for this kind of larger ongoing study. And it became, I had my kids were 5 and 2 when the pandemic hit. And so I had my own young kids at home, kind of without childcare and without schooling. And I'm trying to kind of scramble and keep this project going. And I think that, on top of the stories that I heard from the women that we've been following for multiple years at that point, just made it so painful fully obvious, how much of an impact the COVID pandemic was having on families with young children, and particularly on the women in those families who were not only handling the bulk of the responsibility for childcare, but also, making sure that elderly parents got, their medications got taken care of during the pandemic, taking care of neighbors who needed meals dropped off when they got sick, filling in for colleagues who had kind of added care responsibilities during the pandemic. And so this was, very much a gendered experience for so many of the people that we were talking to. And so wanting to understand, how did we get here? How did we not learn from this crisis moment that we faced was very much part of the impetus for writing this book, which was not the book I planned to write, but a book that is very close to my own heart, the one that at times was difficult to write, both emotionally, given the topic involved, and even logistically. I joke that most of the writing for this book happened between 5 and 7 a.m. before my kids got up for the day. And so this was, very much a labor of love in that sense, but also sometimes a labor of fury too.
Oh my goodness. That does sound very difficult. Do you mind me asking how old your children are?
Yeah, they're now 10 and 7.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So they were very little. I loved all the individual stories. It was very unique. I thought that was very interesting how the COVID pandemic really brought a lot of these problems to even more to the forefront, right? Brought it more to light. The imbalance of how much of the weight of the work falls on women.
Indeed. And it's not that women weren't already doing the disproportionate share of this labor. And I talk about this as women standing in for the social safety net. It's not that that wasn't the case pre-pandemic, certainly. And it's not that this went away, as we've moved back to a sense of normalcy, even in the wake of COVID as well. This is still a situation where women are doing the vast majority of both the unpaid and the underpaid caregiving labor that exists in the US.
Yes, you gave a lot of great examples of how women are serving as safety nets. And I'd love to go over some of those if you don't mind.
No, sure. And so essentially what the data show is that women in the US do almost twice as much unpaid caregiving labor as men do, kind of work for, work caring for their children, caring for the elderly, caring for the sick in their families and kind of in their communities in a sort of informal kind of way. And on top of that, women in the US also, and disproportionately women of color, also do the vast majority of the underpaid caregiving work. So work in fields like childcare and home health care, which are among the lowest paid jobs in the US economy as a whole. And so women are really getting hit on both fronts, in the sense of both doing the kind of labor that is deeply undervalued in our society and deeply underpaid as a result, and then also bearing the brunt of the kind of completely unpaid work that often happens at home.
Another great point that you made is how women's labor is just, any work that becomes women's work is just undervalued, right? We see that even in healthcare, women's jobs, or even OBGYNs actually, were compared to other specialists, they were paid less. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a place where it's sort of a double-edged sword, in the sense that both the work that women disproportionately do tends to get devalued over time. If you have more women move into a given specialty or a given occupation, the wages relative to other similar jobs tends to go down. And at the same time, women are also pushed into the kinds of labor that are difficult to make a profit off of. And so thereby, there's an incentive to pay them less. And so either this is because it's work that is incredibly labor intensive, things like childcare, where you'll often have, for infant care, you have a state required ratio in many places of, one adult for every 4 children. And so that's, a huge amount of labor, and the costs of that spread over a small number of families, which makes it very hard to have that be affordable for families, and also labor that is well paid for the people who are doing that work. And so women disproportionately get pushed into those kinds of jobs that are incredibly labor intensive, but also kind of needed on a broad scale, in a way that, it's not just the elite of the elite who need a personal stylist, for example. It's that everybody needs childcare, everybody needs elder care, in ways that make this is part of why other countries invest in strong social policies that subsidize the work of care, but we don't tend to do so here.
I know. I mean, why do you think that is? Why is it we're behind all these other developed countries? Why aren't we among our peers here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things going on here. The very short answer here is essentially billionaires and big corporations, and the power that they wield in the US is much stronger than what we've seen elsewhere, in the sense that, I mean, yes, certainly, women in almost all parts of the world do a disproportionate share of the caregiving, relative to men. But places that have invested in stronger social safety net policies, in policies like universal childcare, universal paid family leave, universal health care, it helps to take some of the burden off in ways that make life more equal, for men and women and for people of all genders. And what happened in the US is that essentially billionaires and big corporations have figured out that they can keep their costs low and their profits high by refusing to invest in the kind of social safety net that would, actually take care of people, and that they are able to maintain that system oftentimes by forcing women to do the unpaid and underpaid work of care instead. And I'm happy to talk about how they force women to do that. But I mean, really, it's a situation where, the reality is that there's far more of us than there are of them. There's far more regular people than there are billionaires and big corporations. So we could push back against this model if we really wanted to. But I show in the book how, there's a series of policy decisions that have made this possible. But there's also a series of cultural decisions, in the sense that those same billionaires and big corporations that have, helped to shape our policies, in part through the influence that they can have electorally because of, policy decisions like Citizens United, which lets people put unlimited amounts of money into politics. They also control large portions of our media landscape in ways that can make it easy to promote myths that delude us into thinking that we can get by without a strong social safety net, and that also to work to keep us divided by things like race and class and gender and politics in ways that keep us from coming together to challenge the power that billionaires and big corporations have in our society, or to be able to demand the kind of support that we need and deserve.
I do find it interesting how people vote against their best interests, and I guess you touched upon why that may be happening. I guess the media control, of course, and we have seen that. I mean, I think that contributed to our, my exodus from Twitter to Blue Sky, and recently this mass exodus to Blue Sky, which I kind of feel is reassuring. How come there is a bunch of us, millions of us, that see that this is toxic, and yet why did the election, why did that happen? Why did millions also support Trump and, this right wing agenda that is much more benefiting billionaires and corporations?
Yeah, I mean, and this is a place where I think these myths are incredibly powerful, in the sense that, I mean, one of them that I talk about in the book is this idea of the myth of meritocracy, which is just this notion that anyone who works hard enough, can be successful in our society, and that the people who are successful, deserve their success because they must have just worked harder than everybody else to get there. And the research doesn't really back up those kinds of assertions. The reality is that, plenty of people work extremely hard, but never see a payoff for those kinds of efforts. And plenty of people who are successful, economically, didn't necessarily have to actually work all that hard to get where they are, or at least harder than everybody else. And, despite those realities, what the research shows is that most Americans continue to believe, or at least the majority of Americans continue to believe in these kinds of meritocratic ideas because there's psychological benefits to doing so, particularly in a society as unequal as ours is. People are more likely to believe these ideas in more unequal societies. And that's in part because, for people at the bottom of the economic spectrum, this idea gives them hope that, that if they keep working hard, if they keep having faith, that they'll have a good life too someday. And for people at the top end of the spectrum, I mean, that idea offers validation to people in the sense that it makes them feel comfortable in their own privilege, and that they don't have to feel guilty for having more than other people do. And so, I mean, and to that end, this kind of idea, what I find in my research is that it can lead even people who would benefit from stronger social safety net policies to reject the need for those policies. Even if that would leave them better off themselves. I talk about this one mom who I call April, who's a white evangelical Christian Republican mom, and she's getting by on a fairly low income. Her husband makes about $30,000 a year as a pastor at their church, and yet she rejected the need for kind of any social program I threw at her, from, universal health care to universal paid family leave to childcare, and to talking to her about why she really bought into this kind of meritocratic ideology. And what I found in talking with her and with other moms in similar situations was that essentially believing this idea that success is the product of hard work allowed her to convincing herself that she didn't need that net, that like, well, I work hard enough that I can get by without that kind of support. It essentially allowed her to feel morally superior to those who were just a little bit worse off than she was. And she often talked about that in kind of racialized terms, in the sense of seeing herself as a white woman, as superior to other Black and Latina moms who she perceived as kind of less good parents. And so it's this idea that by saying, oh, well, those policies are just for people who are lazy. Those policies are just for people who don't work hard enough, allowed her to feel like, well, if I accept these policies, then that means that I need them too. And what does that say about me? And so I think these kinds of ideas are, unfortunately, widespread in our society, and they operate in ways that push people to lean into racism and sexism, and that can persuade people to, reject, it's kind of a, biting off your nose to spite your face kind of situation, in the sense that, she wants to feel superior, but she's willing to give up the possibility of an actual better life to maintain that sense of superiority.
Yes, that was a really fascinating story. I think you talked about that. I think you talked about it under the Supermom myth. Is that right? Like her story. And then there was the opposite, like another version of Supermom, which is like the modern mom that is trying to be super parent and read all the books and do all the latest things. And also in a competitive way, feeling somehow like doing all these things will give her kids a better chance versus others, right?
Yeah, I mean, we tell women that, like, if you just make these right choices, and of course what those right choices are can vary, in the sense that, sometimes it's, oh, well, if you just, lean into being a trad wife, if you just stay home and find a husband who can support you, everything will be great. Or, if you just major in a STEM field and get a high-powered career, you'll be fine. And, what's often linking these together is that we're kind of gaslighting women. We're telling women that their choices should save them, and that they don't need or deserve a higher level of support. And that's often what's linking together, women from across, wide swaths of the spectrum, in terms of whether it's, stay-at-home moms, or moms who are working for pay full-time, moms who use childcare versus moms who don't, women without children, women with children. It's often kind of linked together by this notion that, you should just be making these good choices, and that should make you fine. But what I find in my research is that even for women, who are working for pay and trying to have it all, they've been kind of sold this kind of corporate version of feminism, where it's this notion that if you just lean in, for example, then you should be able to compete with men just as well in the workforce. And that so many of the moms that I talked to that were in high-powered careers felt this kind of pressure to simultaneously, be able to be a role model for their daughters, for their colleagues, for other women in their industries. But at the same time, it felt like this incredible pressure to also be these fully committed, moms who were home as much as possible and involved in every aspect of their kids' lives in ways that were just completely unsustainable. I talked to one mom who I talk about in the book, who described it as like having two tickers running constantly in her head, the work ticker and the home ticker, just constantly reminding her of all of the things that she needed to do and think about, and leading her to judge herself and to see herself as failing, as opposed to saying, oh, wait, there's this whole system that is built in ways that are designed intentionally, to keep me trapped and to keep me struggling, and to be that safety net for everyone else, as opposed to the other way around.
Right. And I think it's so interesting that, this has become such pervasive thinking. I mean, I'm a Gen Xer, grew up in the 80s. I very much bought into the meritocracy myth. It's not until you really look at it that it falls apart, and you could make all the right choices and work very hard and still fail in this country. So, and it's sort of strange to me to think, we pay more taxes than a lot of corporations and billionaires. So it's strange that people don't feel somewhat like their government. I know that no one likes to feel like they're taking, charity, but it's not really charity if we are funding the government, then government should provide our safety net. So I find that a little like, well, how did we get to this place? I do want to talk about, you mentioned earlier, I want to talk about the myths, all of the myths, because I thought those were very interesting. But before we go to that, you mentioned how women are often pushed into these roles, like, and by our policies or, society. So could you spend a few moments talking about that?
Absolutely. So broadly speaking, and this is kind of the question of like, how do we get women to do this work? Why aren't women taking to the streets and revolting? Is sort of the question here. And broadly speaking, there's sort of two different pathways or two different ways that women are often pushed into both underpaid and unpaid caregiving roles. And you can kind of think of them as both the carrot and the stick. And, the carrot version involves, socialization or really grooming girls for caregiving roles from the time they're old enough to hold a baby doll or the time they're old enough to like push a toy vacuum or, help in the kitchen with mom. And then kind of layering on top of that, teaching girls that they should find intrinsic satisfaction in this kind of caregiving. Rather than expecting things like economic rewards, they should find value in being a mom or caring for others or, dropping off that beautiful homemade pie to a neighbor. And that's where you should find your value, that this is kind of ingrained in women from a very young age. And at the same time, certainly some young girls or young women kind of balk at that responsibility. They realize very early on that either this just isn't for them or, that there's some risks that come with buying into this model. And so that's where the stick version comes in the sense that the stick model here often involves pushing women usually into motherhood and then denying them access to any support in raising their children. And this is part of where things like attacks on abortion, attacks on contraception come in. Because essentially, if you can push a woman into motherhood before she's ready, and if you can leave her with no support in raising her children, it becomes very easy to force her to settle for a less than ideal partner or a less than ideal job, or in some cases both. A partner who's not going to help with the unpaid labor or a job that forces you to do all of this underpaid caregiving labor as well. And in the book, I kind of lay this out in part through the story of a young woman that I call Brooke, who ironically ended up both having kids and working in childcare, despite not ever wanting to be a mom herself. She's a young woman who, like many young women, got pregnant in college and initially planned to get an abortion, but her parents found out, and her parents are very conservative evangelical Christians, and they don't believe in abortion and persuaded her that they would help her raise the baby. But she ultimately, what they figured out though, once she had her son, was that they couldn't afford both college and childcare. And at the same time, Brooke didn't trust her parents to help with caring for her son. And so that meant, night classes were off the table, but she needs to be able to work for pay. And so she ends up ultimately dropping out of college and moving out with her son into a women's shelter and signing up for welfare. And at the same time, welfare came with work requirements. So now she has to find a job in order to qualify for this meager level of support. And ultimately the best full-time job that she can end up finding is a job in childcare, which she was nervous about at first because she's like, I don't even know if I really like kids. I'm not sure if this is for me. And she did end up liking it. But even when she got promoted to assistant director of the childcare center, she was still only making $25,000 a year. And so this was just, the kind of situation where she wanted to go back to college. She wanted to finish her degree, but she couldn't figure out a way to make it work, without additional childcare for herself and needing this job to make ends meet. This was just a sort of impossible situation. And unfortunately, that's, all too common when it comes to the ways that women get pushed into and forced into doing this kind of work for their families and also for their communities.
Yes. And I feel like with, ever since Roe was overturned and now other policies, women are being forced into pregnancy and childbirth. So the first part of what you said reminded me of I guess we can talk about the myths now, the Mars-Venus myth that you talk about in the book, which I think very much, this reinforcing these gender stereotypes also contributes to this problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, like the myth of meritocracy, I mean, this myth operates to kind of reinforce stereotypes, whether, if the myth of meritocracy enforces kind of race and class-based stereotypes, to some extent gendered ones too, the myth of Mars and Venus is very much about normalizing and reifying this idea that men and women are naturally different and that those kind of quote unquote biological or natural differences are the basis of the different social roles that men and women play in society. That women, for example, are just naturally better suited for caregiving than men are. And like the meritocracy myth, though, this these ideas aren't supported by the data. Men can be just as effective at caregiving as women can be. And if anything, if we do see these differences in men's and women's skills, it gets back to that idea of socialization, this idea that girls are trained for caregiving roles from such an early age, which, creates the perception that they're better at this, oftentimes because they have more practice. They're the ones who are tasked with caring for younger siblings or cleaning up their house in ways that young boys often aren't held to those same standards. And yet, again, despite these realities, many Americans kind of buy into this idea that there are these kind of innate gender differences between men and women that explain their differences in preferences or their differences in roles. And those beliefs are disproportionately held by men. But it's one of the things that I stress in the book is that it's men who buy into these ideas, men who buy into this notion that men and women are just distinctly different, or that, women are less suited for paid roles, for example, than men are. It's not necessarily that they hate women. Instead, really, men believe this myth. They buy into this myth in part because they don't want to see themselves as bad guys. Because in the context of this sort of DIY society model that we have without a strong social safety net of policies, men have an incentive to do as little care work as possible. You were kind of mentioning this trickle down of risk before. And essentially, when we don't have a strong social safety net, when we can't kind of fall back on the government to help us take care of ourselves or take care of our loved ones, all of us have an incentive to try to, work for pay as much as possible and push as much of the unpaid labor of care onto other people, or the underpaid labor of care. And oftentimes that means, from men onto women, but also from women with a little bit more privilege onto women who are in systematically marginalized or vulnerable positions. And so there's sort of this trickle down model. And that's very much where men fall into this equation too, in the sense that, in this model, men have an incentive to offload the care work because that allows them to focus on getting ahead career-wise. And, research backs this up in the sense that men whose wives stay home or do more of the care work, have higher salaries and are able to get ahead more easily in their careers. And so the men know this, and there's a strong incentive to do this. But at the same time, the men who do this, the men who push more of that work onto their wives or the women around them, they don't want to see themselves as bad guys, essentially, for exploiting women around them. And so what the myth does is that it allows those men to feel better about themselves, to feel like, oh, no, you're not actually just exploiting women. It's that they're happiest at home. It's that they're actually, it's better for everybody if you focus on your paid work and she focuses on the responsibilities at home. And that's what I heard from many of the men that we talked to. I talk in the book about this one man who I call Dennis, who kind of leaned his, when their children were young, his wife dropped out of the paid workforce because it was so hard to find childcare and because she was earning so much less than he was, even though they had similar levels of education. And at the same time, he leaned very heavily on this idea that, oh, she's just happiest at home, as a way to justify what he talked about as the perks of having a stay-at-home wife. He could, not have to use his paid time off when the kids got sick, or he could, stay at the office longer, or not have to come home and make dinner because his wife was at home, but he could allow himself to feel okay with that, even though he talked about himself as like, oh, well, we don't believe in that gender stuff. He still felt like, well, she's just happiest at home. He treated it as a sort of personality trait or this natural difference in ways that made him feel okay with these inequalities at home.
Okay, some of those stories were infuriating, I have to admit. I mean, yes, like the men were using this Mars-Venus concept, gender stereotypes, to kind of tell themselves what you're saying, like, oh, well, she likes it better at home. She's just more of a nurturer. And it was giving them more free time. And, and there's this illusion that they're working a lot more because they're making money, but the woman's job never seems to end.
No.
Yes. So yes, thanks for sharing that. That was very interesting. I also thought it was interesting how the women were making excuses for them. They're so kind. They're so kind, So that was interesting.
And I think this is a place where our system is structured in ways that it's risky for women to push back. I mean, so often, the advice or the question I get is, well, why don't men just do more? And, the risk with that, I mean, yes, men in most households should be stepping up and doing more, but what's the mechanism to get them to do that? Oftentimes, tell men to do more means tell women to nag more. And for a lot of women who are in these sort of precarious positions, nagging more can come with real risks. Complaining about their husbands, complaining about their partners who aren't doing very much. I mean, there were women that I talked to that recognized the real risks of that, who had been in either previously or currently in situations where they didn't necessarily trust their partners, to have their best interests at heart. And so oftentimes these could be sort of a self-gaslighting situation where it felt easier in some cases to just say, this is good enough. And I talked to women who said, look, I was taught that if he doesn't hit you, you stay. And that was the baseline for what they were, what they were taught was a good enough relationship. And so compared to that standard, any level of support from a partner seems good or can be justified as good. And that's what, unfortunately, so many women in our society are taught. And then once they make decisions, once they're put in a position where maybe because of the cost of childcare, they can't afford to, keep their own job, for example. So many of the women that I talked to got pushed out of the paid workforce once they had one kid, or especially once they had two kids because of the childcare costs. And for women in those situations, once they no longer have an income of their own, it can be incredibly risky to ask more from their partners because they don't have a financial cushion to lean back on, especially if they, risk divorce in the process. And even on top of that, a number of women that I talked to even talked about how if they did leave their husbands, their communities wouldn't support them, especially women who were in kind of conservative Christian communities. I talked to one mom, for example, who was sexually assaulted by her husband and kind of talked to her community, tried to kind of suss out, like, will the women around me support me if I try to leave him, or if she ended up becoming pregnant unexpectedly as a result of that, and kind of thought about abortion, but recognized that the women in her community wouldn't support her, and that she'd have nowhere to turn for support if she left her husband or if she had an abortion. And so she ultimately decided to stay and have the baby, and ended up in a sort of deep depression as a result of it, and really ended up just living almost a separate life from her partner in the same household, that she just tried to avoid him as much as possible and just said, I'll make this work. But it's, in part because of health insurance. She's like, I can't, I know that I won't be able to afford, the mental health care that I need, the medications that I need. She had some chronic health issues. And this was just a deeply difficult, kind of emotionally challenging situation. But that lack of support from her community made it incredibly hard for her to feel like she could push back or demand more from her husband, or even the basic respect and dignity of her body in their relationship too. So.
Right. Women are, contrary to what some men will say online, women do suffer more from a divorce, after divorce financially. So many can't afford it. And to your point, like in these Christian communities, like the one you pointed out, her entire group was the church group, right? So where would she go after? So, okay, so we talked about the Mars-Venus myth. Could you expand on the Supermom myth? Because I thought it was interesting, the two examples you gave, which were kind of very opposite. Because I always thought of the Supermom myth as the, career mom trying to do it all. But your other example was also very interesting, and you briefly touched on it, but I would love for you to explain that, because I think that's really very fascinating.
Absolutely. So the Supermom myth I talk about in the book is this idea that women shouldn't need support from the government or even from their husbands, because they're the ones who are best suited to kind of keep their kids safe and happy and healthy. And I link this in the book to some of, even back to things like the satanic panic that happened in the 1980s and 1990s around childcare, and the sort of vilification of mothers who are not, carefully watching over their children, and using this as sort of the threat of stigma around not being a good enough mom. And I show in this chapter, kind of through the case of a couple of different moms with very different work situations, how for women, regardless of their circumstances, this pressure that they face to kind of make choices around what is good for their children, and to believe that they themselves are not worthy or deserving of support, can lead them to make choices that can essentially self-gaslight them, can lead them to blame themselves for their struggles, as opposed to looking for more support. And one of the moms that I talk about, it's actually another evangelical mom, who's Kara, who's a multiracial white and Asian American mom. And she's a mom who became a stay-at-home mom in part because got pushed out of the workforce because of, childcare complications. And like some moms in that situation, she really struggled with a sense of isolation and a loss of identity that came with being a stay-at-home mom, until a friend of hers encouraged her to join an evangelical Christian moms group. And being part of that group really reframed her thinking around motherhood. She talked about how she was learning to be less selfish and learning to focus on being thankful for just the opportunity to have children and even the opportunity to sacrifice herself for her children. She said, I think I have the quote written down here. She said, well, this is what God has given me. When I feel really burnt out, I can do it cheerfully, and he'll give me the strength to get through it, and he'll give me the rest when I need it. And so essentially, the messages that she was hearing from other women in her church group was that it would be selfish of her to ask for more support, from her husband, from the government. And they ultimately also persuaded her that she should just be grateful to have kids and not to kind of feel like she could ask for anything more from the people around her. And so this became a situation where, it's putting the isolation that women experience. We often think about sort of, the mommy wars between women working for pay and women who are stay-at-home moms. But really what they share in common is often, I think what we often ignore with the stay-at-home moms is first, that these are often not moms who are in a highly privileged position economically, that some of the surveys that I conducted during the project looking at parents across the US, essentially roughly 75% of stay-at-home moms in the US have household incomes of less than $50,000 a year. So these aren't, the stereotypical types of stay-at-home moms. And the vast majority of them are pushed out of the workforce because of childcare costs. And most of them struggle with this kind of transition to being at home, even if they're part of, Christian communities or communities that have high rates of stay-at-home motherhood. And this creates an opening, the kind of isolation, the kind of loss of identity, the kind of instability that can come with this situation for many, mothers who are pushed home or pushed into, part-time work, for example, can leave them vulnerable to this kind of messaging that offers them an alternative sense of identity. And it's ironically similar to the sense of the alternative sense of identity that other women get through, just focus all your energies on paid work and leaning in. So it's they're both kind of operating in ways that tell women that they should be able to do it alone and that they should blame themselves if they're struggling, as opposed to needing or deserving more support.
I thought that was one of the more interesting things, just that you made this parallel, and those groups do have a lot in common. They're basically trying to be perfect moms, either traditional in the traditional way or the modern way, but they're both taking on way too much responsibility for their children's outcomes. And exactly, like feeling guilty about, needing time off, for example, or something like that.
Exactly.
And just the immense sacrifice both groups make. I really love that you pointed out that traditional, stay-at-home mom families are often struggling financially, because right now, of course, on social media, there's all this like utopian tradwife content that makes it look so glamorous, but women do need to understand it's highly risky to get yourself in that situation where you have no financial, say, perhaps even, or your own finances, and you're often paycheck to paycheck with just your husband's paycheck, right?
Yeah.
So
And the irony is that a lot of those women who are the influencers online get started because they're looking for extra income to supplement, they're struggling financially. And so they need that extra, income from sponsors to be able to make ends meet if their husbands are the primary breadwinners and they don't have a high income. And so this becomes a way to contribute financially. And it's ironically the same thing, the same kind of pressures that push women into things like MLMs, multi-level marketing types of schemes, whether it's, selling products to friends or recruiting other friends to be part of these paid opportunities, because women in these positions, are looking both for that sense of identity that comes from being able to be part of a community, and for oftentimes opportunities to make a little money, because this is often a very difficult life that they're trying to get by in. And yet at the same time, we have to ask, why is this appealing? Why is tradwife content? So why are so many of us, glued to the TV or glued to our screens when we're watching this kind of content? And I think it speaks to the fact that, unlike men, we have seen women kind of make big strides in the past couple of decades in terms of having opportunities in our society, whether it's increasing participation in higher education, whether it's having rates of paid workforce participation that are almost as high as men's are. But at the same time, what we ignore when we talk about the progress that women have made is the fact that women's kind of advances on the workplace front and on the education front haven't been coupled with men's advances in participating in the unpaid work of care, and haven't been coupled with equality in terms of rewards, economic rewards for the work that women are doing. And so we have a situation where, women are now both doing all the paid work, doing a lot of paid work, and also still responsible for this second shift of, care work, of childcare, of housework at home. And they're also still disproportionately pushed into lower paid jobs. For example, the elementary school teacher, for example, it's roughly 89% women, for example, and the median salary is somewhere around $63,000 a year. Whereas if you look at software engineers, that's a job that I believe is about 75% men and has a median income of around $133,000 a year. So it's roughly double what the average elementary school or what the median elementary school teacher is making. They both require similar levels of education, but one is this, predominantly male job, and one of them is this predominantly female job. And yet, this creates this situation where women are in a circumstance where, they're joining the paid workforce. They're still doing all this work at home. And even when they are working for pay, they're not being paid at the same rates that men are. And this creates a situation where women feel like they're getting a raw deal. And so for some women in that circumstance, it's easy to feel like, well, if I just opted out, if I just cut off one of these pieces. Some women are saying, well, maybe I just won't have kids. Other women are saying, well, what if I just drop out of the paid workforce? What if I just stay home and find a man who can support me instead? They're looking for some way to make it work. They're trying to find that magic solution that makes it easier, as opposed to, I would argue, kind of saying, why is the system so broken that all of us are struggling in this way? They're looking for an individual quick fix that can solve the problem for them instead.
Yes, I really believe that it's, women are full human beings with their own hopes and dreams. And I really don't think, I feel like that I agree with you. I think the tradwife content is appealing because they're exhausted. So yes, it's like an escape hatch, a fantasy land, that it looks like you can spend your days creating magical creations in the kitchen, if that's your passion, or whatever it is, gardening, insert your passion, but it really is a fantasy, isn't it? And, so, okay, the other two, we talked about the meritocracy myth, and then also this, I think you touched upon this, but women should, the myth that it's your bad choices. You should make better choices. Could you comment on that a little?
Yeah, and this is one that's like personal for me in a way, in that, when I was growing up, the last thing my mom would say to me whenever I left the house was make good choices. And I think it's this thing that, like, it sounds good in theory, that we tell people, it's empowering, if we tell people that you are in control of your own choices and that you can control your own destiny. At the same time, I think it risks victim blaming to some extent, in the sense that, we live in a society where women still do face high rates of violence, where they do still face inequalities in the workforce, in the home. And if you tell women, well, you should just make good choices and you'll be fine, what that risks is having women blame themselves if things don't work out in the end, if they are subject to violence, or if they are, put in a situation where they don't make as much money as the men around them, or where they struggle to balance their care responsibilities with their paid work responsibilities, for example. And I think this idea that good choices can save us, it really confuses kind of correlation and causation, in the sense that there are some choices, things like, getting married, or waiting to have children, or going to college, or, majoring in a STEM field, that are correlated with better outcomes for women, in the sense that women who are making those choices tend to have higher incomes, tend to have more stability, tend to have more equal partnerships. But at the same time, I think what that ignores is the fact that it takes a great deal of privilege to often make those choices in the first place, in the sense that women who have more resources, whose families have more resources, are often in a position to, as we saw with Brooke, for example, to stay in college, or to wait to have children, or to, be able to find the right partner before they get married, as opposed to getting pushed into a less than ideal relationship, for example. And then on top of that, it also ignores the fact that even just making those quote unquote good choices doesn't guarantee that women's lives will work out in the end. And so many of the women that I talked to, thought they had made all those good choices, waited to have kids, got married, went to college, got a good job on the front end, but then ran into some kind of problem, ran into some kind of challenge that pushed them off course. And realized in the process, how precarious our system is for people who, especially those who don't have privilege to fall back on to protect them in the end.
What are some things that just got me thinking, like, what are some things you're concerned about, policy changes that might be coming with the new administration that you think may be worsening the problems?
I think certainly attacks on reproductive freedom are at the core of this. And, like we talked about before, one of the fastest and most efficient ways to force a woman to stand in for the social safety net, or anyone, is to kind of trap them in motherhood, push them into motherhood when they're not ready, or into caring for children, and then leave them with no support to care for those kids. And certainly I think the policies that we've seen as part of Project 2025, for example, would not support reproductive freedom, and would also not do anything to improve, and might even chip away at the existing social safety net protections that we do have. And so would make it potentially even harder for women in particular to be able to escape the kind of precarity that leaves them with limited options, not only in terms of, having children, but also in terms of what kinds of jobs they take or what kinds of partners they end up having to settle for. And so I think this is, compounded by attacks on reproductive freedom, the risk of, attacks on things like no-fault divorce can also work to trap women in similar kinds of ways. And that's something to keep an eye on. Attacks on, contraceptive access are sort of related to these too. And then I think there's also a broader set of risks, which is, we've been on this track where we have kind of steadily dismantled key aspects of the social safety net, and moved away from a model where, especially, the billionaires and the big corporations pay their fair share for a social safety net. Corporate tax rates and tax rates on billionaires have plummeted in recent decades. And we've also seen policies put in place that make it easier for people with large amounts of wealth to leverage that wealth for more control over policy. And I think that's a place where we will continue to see the power of wealth kind of leveraged increasingly to shape policies in ways that make life harder for regular working people, leave them with less power to change jobs, to find good opportunities to support their families on the income that they're making, and at the same time leave them with very little protection from a social safety net in terms of if they do lose their jobs or if they don't make enough to make ends meet. The kinds of underinvestments in, whether it's unemployment, underinvestments in welfare policies, underinvestments in the education system, can all kind of put more responsibility. Certainly, we still don't have a childcare system, even though we've tried a number of times. We still don't have paid family leave, and we still don't have a decent healthcare system that helps to ensure, so many of the moms that I talked to talked about how they were going broke just to afford healthcare. And this is just, these are challenges that families are already up against. And I worry that we're heading toward a system that will only make things worse.
What are the countries that are doing it right? And what are some of the policy changes? What policies do they have that are working that we should try to be moving towards?
Yeah, so the places that tend to be the best, both for women and for people overall. And the irony is that those two things often do go hand in hand, and that the countries that are good for women, it's not that, women doing well tends to come at the expense of men. It's actually that the countries where women are doing well tend to be places where everybody's actually doing better. And that's because when we think about, social safety net policies, for example, it's easy to get into like policy specifics, like how many weeks of paid leave, for example. But really, I think we have to think about what are those policies trying to achieve, regardless of the specifics. And really, we can break it down into like three broad buckets, in the sense that strong social safety nets allow all people to live with dignity, to get the care and the opportunities and the resources that they need to have lives that are dignified from birth through natural death. And then also they give people access to economic opportunities that give them the chance to participate in the paid workforce to the extent that they are able and willing, and give them the chance to better themselves through that kind of opportunities with paid work. And then the third piece is about kind of ensuring that everyone has the time and the energy to participate in a shared project of care. And so if the second kind of branch of policy is about helping people to participate in paid work, this third branch is about preventing paid work from demanding so much of our time or our energy that we have no incentive to participate in helping to care for the people around us. Because even if we have universal childcare policies, for example, or elder care policies, that doesn't, we can't offload or outsource all of the care responsibilities that we have for the people in our lives. There's too much to outsource, and we don't want to outsource all of it. We want to be involved in our kids' lives, involved in our parents' lives, have time to spend with our friends and our loved ones. And really this third bucket of policies, which can look like things like, 4-day work weeks or, 35-hour work weeks or guaranteed paid vacation time, that these kinds of policies can help to ensure that all of us have the time and the energy to participate in that shared project of care. And that can lead to more equal participation. So in places like France, for example, that have put stricter limits on paid work, you see men and women both doing less of the unpaid care work and doing it more equally compared to men and women in the US. And so it's both more equal and easier on everyone in the context where you have kind of strong investments in care policies and also protections around paid work that make it more sustainable for people to do this kind of work. And that's the case with many places in Western Europe and certainly places in Scandinavia. Sweden, for example, is another great example when it comes to policies with everything from universal paid family leave to childcare to healthcare, even like monthly payments for families with young children, retirement pensions, kind of universal programs for elder care. And in the context of those policies, this leads to better outcomes in so many ways for women when it comes to things like lower rates of maternal mortality, lower rates of postpartum depression, higher rates of employment for women, especially moms with young children have higher rates of employment and smaller wage gaps between men and women too. And certainly lower rates of poverty, especially for women and especially for children in these contexts that really use policy to take care of people as opposed to forcing people to take care of themselves.
I loved that towards the end of the book, you kind of painted that vision and what it would take to achieve, which is not too much. It sounds like a win-win. I mean, really, I think you mentioned higher taxes on the uppermost groups, corporations, individuals, right?
I mean, there's so much that we could do with taxes on billionaires. Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's easy for people to get scared off by ideas around like new policies that involve, historic investments in childcare or historic investments in education, in part because it feels like, okay, well, where is that money going to come from? It must, if we're going to invest more in something, that must mean I'm going to have to pay more for it. But the reality is that, we have the money in our system to pay for these things already. It's just in the wrong hands. It's just in the hands of people who have been able to manipulate our economics and our policymaking and our media environment for decades in ways that, line their own pockets. And they promised that money would trickle back down, but it hasn't. It's stayed kind of hoarded at the top instead. And so this is a place where policy interventions can make a huge difference in terms of making sure that money gets to the people who really need it. I mean, there's really no reason that we should have the level of wealth inequality that we do in our society today. And this is a place where just moving a little bit of that money could even make a huge difference in terms of, creating and investing in the kinds of policies that would dramatically improve the lives of millions of Americans. And in the same process would also give them more power to prevent, the billionaires from being able to take back that power that they might lose a little bit of in a shift toward a more equal and equitable system. And so I think this is the place. I mean, there's only, less than 1,000 billionaires in the US. This is not a huge group of people that we're talking about, but they hold such a vastly outsized share of the wealth. Yeah.
Yes. So trickle down economics is another myth. But how did these other countries make this happen? I guess it's the power of the people in electing the right people, right? Representing them.
Yeah, certainly. And I think also, I mean, I think there's a number of different factors in terms of how policies work out differently in different places. I think the fact that we have a system, a sort of winner takes all kind of system, as opposed to a more proportional representation kind of a system, the way that we do our elections with electoral colleges, there's a number of ways that our system is structured, and those kinds of the complexities of our political system are compounded by the way that people with wealth have been able to intervene to gradually capture more and more political power, through decisions like Citizens United, for example, which I mentioned before, which, dramatically changed the landscape of funding for elections and made it very easy for people with large amounts of wealth to put their thumb on the scale. Though at the same time, I mean, people with large amounts of wealth have been using their wealth for political influence for a long time. I mean, Betsy DeVos, the former Secretary of Education, in 1997 wrote an op-ed saying her family had given, it was one of the largest donors to Republican politics over the years. And she wrote this op-ed saying, like, I'm always accused of buying influence. And I'm just going to concede the point. Like, yes, that is what we're trying to do. We are trying to buy influence. And went on to later become the Secretary of Education. And so I think this speaks to,
now they're not even hiding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think I think the willingness to constrain those billionaires, the willingness to not, and certainly I think our culture too leans into the myth of meritocracy in ways that make people feel as though people with wealth should be allowed to keep their wealth unfettered because they're perceived as deserving of that wealth or as having worked for that wealth, in that other places that are more skeptical of the myth of meritocracy are more skeptical also of the notion that people with huge amounts of wealth deserve to keep it all for themselves.
It's kind of maddening. No one is even talking about making them poor, right? They would still be wealthy. They would still have more money than a individual human being could use in their own lifetime.
Exactly.
So that's also kind of crazy. So we do have to wind it down. It's been so enjoyable to speak to you about your book. Such an important book. I hope everyone reads it. I did get one audience question. Anonymous. What role can men play in supporting women who are disproportionately burdened as safety nets in our society?
No, this is a great question. And I think certainly this is a place where men can help to, certainly notice the invisible labor that's being done by women. So oftentimes when women want men to get involved, they first have to show men all of the work that they're doing behind the scenes. What's often talked about as sort of the cognitive labor of managing a household or managing childcare responsibilities or other types of caregiving responsibilities. And so I think one first step that men can take is to notice that often invisible labor that women are doing and find ways to help without having to be asked. That can make a huge difference in the context of a household. For men to just step up and say, I'm going to do this task because it needs to be done. I'm not going to wait for someone to ask me or to tell me, and to take ownership in those contexts. I think on a broader level, men can also play a key role in pushing back against these kinds of myths that we see perpetuated in society and in the media. It's so easy. I talk in the book about how things like the myth of Mars and Venus are often perpetuated by humor cultures, particularly in kind of male-dominated online spaces. And men can play a role in pushing back against that when they hear their friends, telling sexist jokes, telling misogynistic jokes, calling that out and saying, this isn't acceptable. We shouldn't be thinking this way, challenging that kind of mythical thinking, whether it's, gender-based thinking or meritocracy-based thinking. And that's something that all of us can be doing in our lives, is noticing when we slip into that kind of mythical thinking ourselves, and calling it out in others and saying, hey, that's not the reality. Let's think about what the evidence actually shows us here and about what that myth might be doing to us if we're willing to buy into those ideas. And so I think those are some small things that people can be doing in their day-to-day lives to help to participate more equitably in that shared project of care and help to change the broader culture, because that's the first step in electing policymakers who will put in place better policies, is persuading people to let go of those myths that lead them to think that we don't need any sort of change.
Thank you so much, Jess. So could you please share if you have any future plans, projects? Are you working on another book? Are you on book tours? What else do you have to share before we have to wrap it up?
Yeah, so I have a number of talks lined up for the spring. I'll be in a couple of different places in the spring of 2025, including Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Vermont, Tennessee. But certainly you can check out my website, which is jessicacalarco.com, which has kind of updated information about all those places that I'll be in the spring, and certainly some recordings of past events that I've been part of too. And in terms of future projects, I think this is maybe, as I've kind of alluded to in some of the things that I've mentioned today, the role of religion in family life and the role of religion in our society more generally is something that I've become more interested in the context of doing the research for this book, and trying to understand kind of how the kinds of religious forces, cultural and institutional, in U.S. society are shaping family life, are shaping trust in institutions, and kind of where we might go from here, particularly in the context of the policy regime that's lying ahead. So that's where I'm thinking of going with some of the projects that I have in terms of next steps.
Great. I can't wait to read your next work or see where else you go. I look forward to that. I hope you'll come back with your next book or project. And what about your socials? Where can people find you to follow your thoughts?
Yeah, you can find me on probably Blue Sky is the best place at this point, at Jessica Calarco. And that's an easy one there. Though certainly I'm also on Threads and Instagram. Instagram, I think it's at Jess Calarco instead of Jessica, just by virtue of sometimes handles are different. But yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay, I always leave with a closing thought, so you have to bear with me. In the patriarchy, women's labor is undervalued, taken for granted, and is not just underpaid, but is often unpaid. In the Gynarchy, we know that the entire world and its economic system heavily relies on the cheap or free labor of women. And we work and look forward to the day when women are truly equal and recognized and rewarded for their immense contributions to society. So down with the patriarchy and up with the Gynarchy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Did you enjoy this episode of the Gynarchy Podcast? Know someone else who might enjoy this conversation? Make sure to subscribe and share the show with your friends and family. Find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and just about anywhere you find podcasts. On social media, we can be found on Blue Sky, Instagram, and TikTok at The Gynarchy. Thank you so much for listening.